On the 19th of October, 2004, construction workers breaking ground for Istanbul's new Marmaray rail tunnel pierced through 21 feet of accumulated earth and struck something extraordinary. Skeletal remains of 36 Byzantine vessels, perfectly preserved in the silted grave of Constantinople's legendary Theodosian Harbour. But these were not ordinary merchant ships. Among the timbers and cargo lay evidence of a catastrophe that the Byzantine chronicles had deliberately obscured: the mass drowning of thousands during the reign of Emperor Justinian I in the 6th century, a tragedy born from imperial vanity and the desperate scramble for survival during one of history's darkest hours. Constantinople, founded in 330 AD by Emperor Constantine I, rose as the new Rome, a jewel between two continents where Europe kissed Asia across the shimmering waters of the Bosphorus. The city's lifeline pulsed through its harbors, none more vital than the Theodosian Harbour, also called the Harbour of Eleutherius. Constructed during the reign of Emperor Theodosius II in the early 5th century, this magnificent artificial basin stretched nearly 1,000 feet along the southern shore, protected by massive breakwaters and capable of sheltering hundreds of vessels. The harbor represented Byzantine engineering mastery, its entrance carefully angled to prevent silting while accommodating the largest grain ships from Egypt. For over 2 centuries, the harbor thrived as Constantinople's commercial heart. Wheat from Alexandria, silk from Persia, ivory from Africa, and amber from the Baltic shores flowed through its stone quays. Merchants from every corner of the known world jostled in its warehouses, their voices creating a polyglot symphony of Greek, Latin, Armenian, Syriac, and countless other tongues. The harbor district, known as the Portus Theodosiacus Quarter, teemed with taverns, counting houses, and the modest dwellings of dockhans, whose calloused hands loaded and unloaded the empire's prosperity. Yet by the year 535, this prosperity balanced on a knife's edge. Emperor Justinian I, who had ascended the throne in 527, harbored ambitions that would have humbled Alexander himself. He dreamed of restoring the Roman Empire to its ancient glory, reconquering the lost western provinces from barbarian kingdoms. His wars against the Vandals in North Africa and the Ostrogoths in Italy demanded an endless river of gold, grain, and military supplies, all of which funneled through Constantinople's harbors. The empire's resources strained under these military adventures. Justinian's building projects, including the magnificent Hagia Sophia Cathedral completed just the year before, had emptied imperial treasuries. His tax collectors, led by the notorious John of Cappadocia, squeezed every copper coin from provinces already struggling with crop failures and plague outbreaks. According to historian Procopius, in his Secret History, a text not discovered until centuries later, discontent simmered throughout the capital as the emperor's ambitions ground ordinary citizens beneath their weight. Then came the darkness. In the spring of 536, the sun dimmed. Contemporary accounts describe how the great celestial orb rose each morning, wrapped in a veil of mist, casting only the palest light, insufficient to create shadows even at noon. This phenomenon, which modern scientists attribute to massive volcanic eruptions in Iceland or Indonesia, ejecting millions of tons of ash into the stratosphere, persisted for 18 months. Temperatures plummeted. Crops failed across the Mediterranean world. From Ireland to Mesopotamia, chroniclers recorded the same terrifying observation. The sun had lost its power. Famine followed the darkness like a hungry wolf. By 537, grain shipments from Egypt had slowed to a trickle. Constantinople's population, swollen beyond 500,000 souls by refugees fleeing the countryside, faced starvation. The Theodosian Harbour, once bustling with merchant vessels, lay increasingly empty, but not for long. What came next would transform it into a mass grave. The plague arrived in Constantinople during the autumn of 541 aboard grain ships from Pelusium in Egypt, though by then few grain ships arrived at all. The disease moved with terrifying speed, transforming the Theodosian Harbour from a place of commerce into humanity's last desperate escape route. Within weeks, the pestilence later known as the Plague of Justinian ravaged the capital with an efficiency that stunned even those who had witnessed war and famine. The afflicted developed painful buboes in their groins, armpits, and necks. Eye fever followed, then delirium, and within days, death. Procopius, who witnessed the catastrophe firsthand, recorded that at its height, the plague claimed 10,000 lives per day within Constantinople's walls. The actual figure was likely lower, but still devastating, perhaps 5,000 daily deaths during the peak months. The living could barely bury the dead. Initially, the deceased received proper Christian burial in the city's necropolises. But within a month, every cemetery overflowed. Bodies accumulated in houses, streets, and churches. The stench of decomposition hung over the city like a malevolent cloud. Emperor Justinian himself contracted the plague but survived, emerging weakened and increasingly paranoid. His recovery did nothing to halt the dying. The imperial administration, already strained by military overextension and financial exhaustion, began to collapse. Theodorus, the imperial referendarius, tasked with organizing mass burials, commandeered every available structure. The towers of the Sicca fortress across the Golden Horn became charnel houses, their roofs removed so corpses could be stacked to the ceiling and beyond, creating grotesque mountains of the dead. In this apocalyptic atmosphere, the Theodosian Harbour transformed into a focal point of class conflict and survival desperation. The wealthy elite, including senators, merchants, and high-ranking military officers, saw the harbour's remaining seaworthy vessels as their salvation. They could flee Constantinople, sail to estates in Anatolia, or distant provinces where the plague had not yet struck. But the harbour warehouses and quays had become refugee camps for thousands of the city's poor-displaced peasants, former dockhands without employment, widows and orphans created by the plague itself. These refugees viewed the ships differently. Each vessel represented food, shelter, and most critically, the means to escape. As the wealthy attempted to provision their escape craft, tensions exploded. In early 542, according to fragmentary accounts preserved in the Chronicle of John Malalas, riots erupted along the harbor's edge. Desperate crowds stormed merchant vessels being loaded with provisions. Armed guards hired by aristocratic families killed perhaps hundreds of rioters, their bodies dumped directly into the harbor's increasingly polluted waters. Justinian, despite his weakened condition, gouged. The harbor had become a powder keg, threatening to ignite class warfare throughout the capital. His solution revealed the cold calculus of imperial power, rather than order the wealthy to remain and share Constantinople's suffering, or permit unrestricted evacuation that might depopulate his capital entirely. The emperor issued a decree that shocked even hardened courtiers. The Theodosian harbor would be closed to all civilian traffic for 6 months. No ships could enter or depart. Those vessels already moored would remain under military guard. The decree, announced in February of 542, sparked outrage across all classes. The wealthy protested they were being condemned to die alongside the poor. The poor, meanwhile, saw the closure as confirmation that the elite would eventually receive special exemptions. Both groups proved partially correct. Justinian's administration did eventually allow certain privileged evacuations, but only for those with direct imperial connections or those willing to pay staggering bribes to palace eunuchs. The military enforcement of the harbor closure fell to the excubitors, an elite guard unit. Their commander, a Bulgarian officer named Opsis, received explicit orders: prevent any unauthorized boarding of vessels by any means necessary. Opsis interpreted any means with brutal efficiency. The excubitors established a perimeter around the harbor district, turning the entire area into a militarized zone. Anyone approaching the waterfront without proper authorization faced arrest or worse. The catastrophe that would condemn the Theodosian harbor to historical obscurity unfolded on the night of the 5th of June, 542. By this date, the plague had raged through Constantinople for 8 months. Perhaps 1/3 of the population had perished. The city's social fabric had disintegrated into a desperate struggle between those with resources and those without. Among the latter, a plan had coalesced, whispered between refugees in the harbor district's cramped shelters. They would take the ships by force. The conspiracy involved perhaps 3,000 souls, primarily able-bodied men, but including women and even children. Their reasoning possessed a terrible logic. The excubitors numbered only 200 soldiers guarding the harbor perimeter. The refugees vastly outnumbered them. They struck simultaneously at multiple points, overwhelming the guards through sheer numbers. They could reach the moored vessels before reinforcements arrived from the imperial palace or military barracks. Once aboard, they could sail before dawn, destination irrelevant, anywhere preferable to plague-ravaged Constantinople. What the conspirators failed to account for was betrayal. Among their number was an Armenian merchant named Sahak, who had lost his family to the plague but retained his commercial instincts. Sahak recognized that information about the planned assault held value. On the 4th of June, he approached Opsis with details of the conspiracy in exchange for guaranteed passage on a vessel for himself. Opsis listened, thanked Sahak, and then had him quietly strangled to prevent word of the betrayal from spreading. The executor's commander saw opportunity not for prevention, but for a demonstration of power that would end Harbour unrest permanently. Rather than arrest the conspirators or reinforce his troops, Opsis allowed the plan to proceed. He secretly requested additional forces from Belisarius, Justinian's greatest general, who was then in Constantinople between campaigns. Belisarius, already disgusted by the plague's chaos, dispatched 300 cavalry from his personal Busalari retinue. These mounted warriors positioned themselves in adjacent streets, invisible to the refugees but ready to deploy within minutes. Shortly after midnight, the assault began. Refugees surged from multiple directions toward the harbor's gates and walls. The initial executor defenders appeared overwhelmed, falling back in seemingly panicked retreat. The refugees, emboldened, rushed forward in a human tide. Thousands more, not part of the original conspiracy but desperate for escape, joined spontaneously. The crowd swelled to perhaps 8,000 as people abandoned the surrounding tenements, carrying children and whatever possessions they could grab. They reached the quays. The moored ships lay before them, 53 vessels ranging from massive grain carriers to small coastal traders. Some refugees immediately began climbing aboard the nearest ships. Others ran further along the docks seeking vessels already provisioned. Families became separated in the chaos. Children screamed for parents. Elderly were trampled. Still the crowd pushed forward, driven by months of terror and starvation. Then Opsis sprang his trap. The executors, who had retreated, suddenly formed a shield wall behind the refugees, cutting off retreat from the quays. Simultaneously, Belisarius's cavalry thundered into the harbor square from 3 directions, their horses creating a living barrier. The refugees found themselves trapped on the narrow stone quays and aboard the ships, with armed soldiers blocking every escape route and the dark waters of the harbor offering the only other exit. Opsis issued no warning or demand for surrender, simply ordered his men to advance with spears leveled. The cavalry closed from behind. The refugees, caught in this lethal compression, had nowhere to go but into the water or deeper aboard the ships. Panic transformed into stampede. People were crushed against stone walls and wooden holes. Mothers held children above their heads as the crowd's pressure became unbearable. According to the historian Evagrius Scholasticus, who recorded the event decades later based on survivor accounts, the screaming could be heard across the Golden Horn in the Galata district. The killing began when the first refugees, pressed from behind by the advancing soldiers and surging crowd, toppled from the quays into the harbor's dark waters. Most Byzantine commoners could not swim, a skill reserved primarily for sailors, fishermen, and those raised along coastlines. These were urban poor, rural refugees, and tradecraft workers. They sank immediately, dragged down by clothing and whatever possessions they still clutched. Others were pushed from overcrowded ships, falling 20 feet from decks into water, already churning with drowning victims. The cavalry made the situation catastrophic. Belisarius's Busalari, hardened soldiers who had fought Vandals and Goths, showed no mercy to desperate civilians. They rode directly into the crowd with swords drawn, cutting down anyone who turned back from the waterfront. Their orders were clear: drive everyone into the harbor, leave no survivors who might spread tales of imperial brutality. The horses themselves became weapons, their bulk and weight crushing those who fell beneath their hooves. The slaughter intensified as refugees climbed aboard the moored vessels seeking safety. The ships, secured by heavy ropes and lacking crews to sail them, became floating prisons. Soldiers followed the refugees aboard, methodically working through the vessels with spears and swords. Some refugees chose to jump rather than face the blades, plunging into water already thick with bodies. Others fought with whatever implements they found: cargo hooks, wooden planks, bare hands, but unarmed civilians stood no chance against armored, trained killers. The massacre continued for 3 hours. By the time false dawn lightened the eastern sky, the Theodosian harbor had become a scene from mankind's darkest nightmares. The water's surface, normally clear enough to see the bottom in daylight, churned with thousands of floating corpses. The bodies bobbed face down, their clothing spread around them like oil slicks, transforming the harbor into a grotesque parody of a flower garden. Blood mixed with seawater, creating a rust-colored foam that lapped against the stone quays. Exact death tolls remain impossible to determine with certainty, but analysis of the archaeological evidence discovered in 2004 provides minimum estimates. The 36 ships excavated contain the remains of at least 2,000 individuals who had climbed aboard during the panic. Sediment layers from the harbor floor, studied by researchers at Istanbul University, contained bone fragments and artifacts suggesting another 3,000 to 4,000 victims sank directly into the mud. Conservative historical estimates place the night's death toll at 5,000 souls, with some accounts suggesting as many as 8,000 perished. Opsis reported to Emperor Justinian that he had suppressed a rebellion and secured the harbor. The emperor, still weakened by plague and increasingly paranoid about threats to his authority, accepted this characterization without question. Indeed, Justinian rewarded Opsis with promotion to Comes Excubitorum, making him commander of all imperial bodyguards. The surviving refugees, those who had not participated in the attempted ship seizure, received the message clearly. Resistance to imperial authority meant death. The aftermath presented immediate practical problems. Thousands of corpses in a confined harbor posed severe health risks in a city already ravaged by plague. Justinian ordered the harbor permanently closed to shipping and designated it a burial ground. Work crews, comprised of condemned criminals and prisoners of war, spent weeks extracting bodies from ships and water. They achieved only partial success. Many corpses had become trapped in cargo holds or sunk too deep for recovery. Rather than continue the gruesome work indefinitely, imperial authorities made a fateful decision. They would deliberately silt up the harbor, burying the massacre site beneath layers of earth. This process began in late 542 and continued intermittently for decades. Earthworks diverted streams into the harbor basin. Demolition rubble from plague-damaged buildings was dumped into the water. Gradually, the Theodosian harbor transformed from Constantinople's commercial heart into a ghost basin. Then a marshy lowland, and finally solid ground over which later generations built without knowing the horror beneath their feet. The deliberate burial of the Theodosian harbor represented more than practical engineering. It constituted historical erasure on an imperial scale. Justinian and his successors understood that the massacre contradicted Byzantine self-mythology. Constantinople prided itself as the Christian empire's capital, a beacon of civilization and divine favor. The truth that its emperor had ordered thousands of his own plague-desperate subjects drowned and entombed in a mass grave could not be reconciled with this narrative. The official chronicles went silent about the harbor's fate. The histories written during and immediately after Justinian's reign, including Procopius's official works commissioned by the emperor, make no mention of events on the 5th of June, 542. Even Procopius's secret history, written as a scathing critique of Justinian's rule, omits specific details about the harbor massacre, perhaps because Procopius composed it while still living in Constantinople, where such explosive revelations would have meant his execution. Only fragmentary, indirect references survived. The 6th century historian Evagrius Scholasticus, writing from Antioch decades after Justinian's death in 565, referenced a great tragedy at the harbor without elaboration. The 8th century chronographia of Theophanes the Confessor mentioned that the Theodosian harbor became cursed ground during the plague years, a phrase suggesting local oral traditions preserved knowledge that official histories suppressed. Arab geographers visiting Constantinople in the 9th and 10th centuries noted ruins of an ancient harbor, but described it as abandoned due to natural silting with no mention of human causation. Byzantine Constantinople continued thriving for another 9 centuries after the massacre. Now the empire's capital shifted its maritime commerce to other harbors, the Golden Horn, the Harbor of Julian, and smaller facilities. The filled-in Theodosian harbor became the Valanga district, home to workshops, modest residences, and eventually Ottoman-era structures after Constantinople's conquest by Sultan Mehmed II in 1453. Generations lived above the mass grave without knowledge of what lay beneath. The modern rediscovery began accidentally, planning for Istanbul's Marmara rail tunnel. Designed to link the city's European and Asian sides beneath the Bosphorus, required extensive archaeological surveys. Turkish antiquities law mandated such investigations before major construction. When excavators breached the ancient harbor in October 2004, they initially celebrated discovering Byzantine maritime history. The first vessels appeared to be ordinary merchant craft, their preservation in oxygen-free mud remarkable, but not unprecedented. Then archaeologists found the bodies, not just the remains of sailors who died in accidents. Densely packed human skeletons showing evidence of trauma-fractured skulls, severed limbs, defensive wounds on forearms. More disturbingly, the remains included numerous children and women, along with personal possessions suggesting refugees rather than sailors, cooking pots, agricultural tools, religious icons. One ship contained 32 skeletons crammed into a cargo hold that should have held grain, their positions suggesting they had been forced inside and possibly sealed in deliberately. Dr. Metin Gakay, lead archaeologist on the excavation, initially proposed the remains represented victims of Constantinople's fall in 1453. However, carbon-14 dating and ceramic analysis conclusively dated the ships and their tragic cargo to the 6th century, specifically the 530s through 550s, precisely the period of Justinian's reign and the plague. Subsequent analysis of stratification patterns revealed the harbor had been deliberately and rapidly filled with earth shortly after the deposits containing bodies. The full truth emerged through interdisciplinary collaboration. Historians cross-referenced the archaeological findings with previously dismissed fragmentary sources. The obscure mentions of harbor tragedies suddenly gained significance. The pattern became clear. A mass killing had occurred, been officially suppressed, and physically buried to hide evidence. Modern Istanbul had literally been built atop Imperial Rome's darkest secret, 15 centuries of soil and stones concealing Justinian's solution to the problem of desperate subjects seeking escape from plague-ravaged streets through his precious harbors.